Resuming debate. Reprise de débat. The honourable member for Guelph.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's a great honour for me to rise today to speak for the first time as the Liberal critic for Veterans Affairs. Over the years, as Member of Parliament and as a member of the Guelph branch of the Royal Canadian Legion, I've spent a considerable amount of time speaking with veterans, new and old, listening to their concerns, and I'm certainly glad to now have the opportunity to hear from them across the country. When deliberating legislation which will have an impact on our veterans, I think something the Veterans Ombudsman has written is particularly relevant and necessary for the adequate consideration of any veterans policy. The Veterans Ombudsman has written that he measures fairness of veterans policy in terms of, first, the adequacy of the program, second, the sufficiency of resources supporting it, and thirdly, accessibility of a program to those seeking assistance. And I have to say, Mr. Speaker, that it takes my breath away to hear the member from Brampton Springdale stand in this House and fill this room with rhetoric and bluster on how much this government is actually doing for our veterans, when he, as a member of the committee, has heard time and time again of the inadequate resources that are given to veterans and the issues that are ailing them. On its face, Bill 568 will require the government to create regulations that would extend health care benefits to former members of the Canadian Forces who meet the necessary requirements and have been honorably discharged, so we know who will access these programs. Adequacy of a program to care for these men and women is a difficult metric to meet, and so it is a particularly sensitive consideration. Throughout the generations, we as a Parliament and as Canadians have asked a select number of men and women to go at a moment's notice to places across the world to protect not just ourselves, but others. When we make this request, there is the understanding that what we are asking of them is not always fair, it is not ever pleasant, and will likely have long-lasting and serious repercussions, both physically and emotionally, on them and their families. Their service requires members to make an incredibly personal and potentially life-altering commitment to place themselves in harm's way virtually anywhere the nation believes necessary. What we ask of them is extraordinary. What we owe them is without measure. That said, there are things we must offer to acknowledge the significance of their sacrifice and responsiveness to the health care and financial needs of former Canadian Forces members. Of late, this Conservative government has not been good about being responsive to the diverse needs of Canadian veterans. Not when they shut down 9 Veterans Affairs Canada offices throughout the country, and certainly not while they show an utter disregard for the social covenant that is owed to veterans by mounting a defense against a lawsuit seeking fairness for former Canadian Forces members in a BC courtroom. I read an article this week in the Chronicle Herald about the uphill battle being faced by Cape Breton veterans Duncan McKeegan, Terry Collins, Charlie Palmer, Dan McNeil, and Ron Clark, who are still trying to cope with the closure of the Sydney office. The article states, and I'm quoting, "There at the Sydney office, caseworkers knew them by name," they say, came to their homes to assess what the estimated 4,200 area vets needed, gave them the kind of one-on-one services and personal support they still need while facing everything from post-traumatic stress disorder to the ailments of age. Just yesterday, at Veterans Committee, we heard from Corporal Mark Fushko, who suffered the loss of both legs while in Afghanistan. He too suffers the same fate as Duncan and Terry and Charlie, facing inadequate responses from government staff who have merely directed him to a 1-800 number where he's forced again and again to leave a message and hope someone calls him back. I'm struck while watching many of these veterans fight for the benefits they deserve by something I've heard many veterans say to me recently. Quote, "You break it, you buy it," end quote. It was the things we asked them to do in the service of their country that broke them. How is it then that we can just turn our heads as if we never saw it happen in the first place and hope that someone else comes to clean it up? Another veteran in an emotional closed session in Guelph said that it felt like they went over heroes and came back zeros. I rose on Monday and asked the government how it can turn its back on a promise that was made a century ago to honor the sacrifice made by soldiers returning from the First World War. I asked the Minister of Veterans Affairs how how it was still possible for him to support the defense of that lawsuit brought in that BC courtroom on behalf of veterans, a defense based on the denial of the existence of a social covenant owed to our veterans, when only weeks ago he finally admitted that, and I'm quoting, "Some have called the work done by Veterans Affairs to be a duty, a responsibility, a commitment, a social contract, or a sacred obligation." And he also said, "I believe it is all of those things." How hypocritical. That is the same social contract that Sir Robert Borden believed it to be in 1914. The same covenant that is the very basis upon which these veterans are now before the court seeking justice. Meanwhile, lawyers for Veterans Affairs Canada continue to argue that the social contract, the sacred obligation we owe, is simply political language used by politicians to get votes, confirming really that messaging and votes are the only reasons this conservative government feigns support for our veterans. On this side of the House, we believe the social covenant is real and tangible. In fact, just weeks ago, after extensive consultation, a resolution was passed with overwhelming support at our own policy convention in Montreal that resolved that Liberals will uphold the principles of that social covenant in both defense and veteran affairs policies, while we live up to our country's sacred obligation to care for veterans and their families throughout their lives, allowing them to maintain a quality of life that is worthy of their great sacrifice. I believe this bill before us, proposed by the honourable member for Saint John, captures this spirit. While serving, members of the Canadian Forces, non-commissioned members and officers alike, have access to a range of health care through Canadian Forces Health Services. Once these members have completed their military occupational classification requirements and then eventually their time in the forces and are discharged honourably, these men and women will have access, regardless of being a pensioner or not, to the health services provided under the regulations of the Department of Veterans Affairs Act. One would assume that includes additional benefits beyond those covered under various provincial health care plans. That being said, I'm under the impression that most Veterans Affairs clients are already under the Public Service Health Care Plan, and so this extends primarily to long-term care and dental services. This leads to a concern I have after reading the bill, namely that there is very little by way of detail. It's not clear where the responsibility for delivery of care lies, or what services are being added to the provision of care for most former Canadian Force members, though the member from Saint John did give some clarity to these issues during his speech today. I find it worrisome, however, that when dealing with veterans issues, so much is left up to the legislative discretion of a government I already believe to be unable to deal adequately with veterans policy. With that in mind, in large part I agree the member of Saint John has sought out the principle of adequacy in his attempt to ensure that the right programs are in place to meet the needs of all of our veterans. I believe its move to broaden the applicability of health services duly removes barriers to accessibility, though I think we need to look closer to ensure that the program can be sufficiently resourced. Well, I would have liked to see more specifics so that there might be more certainty for applicable former members of the Canadian Forces. It is paramount that we guarantee the health benefits along with the well-being of our serving and former Canadian Force members. I thank the member for bringing the bill forward and hope we have more opportunity to discuss this bill in greater depth at committee. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.